Okay, so our starting point, let me do this in black, is going to be the customer segment. So if you convene a group of people and you're starting to work through a business model canvas in order to translate your idea into a potential product or service, the starting point is going to be, do we actually have a customer segment? Is there a possibility that the value proposition we would identify is something that relates to the need that we've identified in amongst our customers? And here there's some quite subtle things going on. So for example, the job to be done, if I'm a manufacturer and I make nails, for example, and I decide that I want to innovate my nails in order to hang pictures on a wall, if my assumption is that a customer goes into a hardware store in order to buy nails, and they therefore look for the best kind of nail to hang a picture, then I might miss the point that using a nail is only one way to hang a picture. There could be any number of ways in which you could hang a picture. So what is the customer actually trying to do? What is the actual segment? What is the job they're trying to get done? They are trying to hang a picture. So I can therefore open my mind to all sorts of possibilities about how I would do that. And manufacturing nails for picture hanging is therefore just one option. If I was in the horse and buggy business prior to the invention of the motor car, if I thought about the product, which is the horse and buggy, or just the buggy possibly, then that gives me a slightly different feel to if I think about the job to be done as being getting the person who has the horse and buggy trying to get from A to B. And therefore, if I shift from horse and buggy to a motor car, then I'm thinking of a product innovation, but I'm not necessarily changing the outcome that the customer is looking for. So I've got to be very careful about this thought about segments, and there's a lot more to be done around this in a lot more detail if you're in a workshop this process. All right. So from here, we're going to move to our value proposition. Now, we've spoken a little bit about the value proposition, but in essence, what we're going to try and do is we're going to map the need to the attributes of a particular product and service or service. We're going to understand the outcomes that the customer wants, the job to be done, and make sure that the features, functionality, and attributes of the products and services in our value proposition map as nearly as possible to this. And there's a trick to this, by the way, and that is that in this particular process, try and identify an individual segment, if possible, through a kind of straw man. So if you can identify a particular individual in an organization, in a client organization that you're trying to serve, put that person's name in the frame. So let's say in this particular instance, we may have Mrs. X is the person who we put in the frame. And then when we design our value proposition, we have that person in mind. Imagine them sitting across the desk or the other side of a lab bench, or in a foyer listening to a presentation, etc. And imagine them thinking about what it is that's of value to them that they would ultimately want to pay for it. So put a straw man or a straw person in there. The next thing we want to look at is this notion of a customer relationship. So let's call this 3. And the customer relationship is about how the customer wants to relate to us. The way that I think about this is if I have a phone call from the dealer of the car that I drive, so the dealership in the UK of the car that I drive phones me up and they say, as they often do, we're having an open day and we think you might be interested in the new models of vehicles that we've got. Now, I don't know what it would be like for you, but for me, that would not be something that I would welcome in terms of relationship. It's too familiar. I've got better things to do with my time. Possibly a better medium than them phoning me might be to send an email, but even then, I'm not particularly keen to spend my time going through emails of that type. However, if I was to get a phone call from the dealership to say, your roadworthiness, your MOT is coming up, and we want to make a booking for you to come and have it done, that's a legal requirement. That's a relationship I do want to have, so that I might actually be quite willing to engage in that kind of a relationship. In Oosterwalder's work, he talks about this continuum. So at the one end of the continuum, you talk about a very passive relationship. So for example, if you went up to a vending machine to buy a sandwich, you put a coin in the machine and the sandwich falls out the bottom, that's a very passive relationship. There's no real relationship there. It's pretty kind of unintimate, if you like. At the opposite end, there's a very active personal relationship at the other end of this continuum. And in that particular instance, this is the situation where perhaps you have a personal broker for your share dealings. Perhaps if you're very wealthy, you have a valet or a butler. Perhaps you have your own chef. If you're a sports person, maybe you have your own physiotherapist, and etc. and so forth. So those are much more personal relationships. And the question that we've got to ask as an organization is, for that segment, given the value proposition that we want to have, what's the kind of relationship the customer wants to have with us? It's not the other way around, by the way. Not what kind of relationship do we want to have with them. It's the reverse. Okay, and we would move from that. So we've gone 1, 2, 3. Now we would move to number 4. In this particular instance, the customer channel is basically how will the customer actually get their hands on our product. And for example, if I was a web-based business, it might be that the customer wants to do a number of different things through my website, and I would think of that as being the channel. And the question I've got is, what kind of architecture and what sort of objective do I have for the channel? So what is the customer trying to do? Are they trying to review my product in comparison to others? So they're doing a comparison, as you would do if you went online and were looking for a camera, for example. You'd be able to line up different options within a retail store. But perhaps I'm trying to do an evaluation. Perhaps I'm trying to find additional information about a particular product or service. Perhaps I'm trying to actually physically pay for the service. Perhaps I've bought the product or the service and I'd like to give some feedback about it, good or bad. Perhaps I've had a failure with either the product or the service and I'd like to try and get a resolution to that, so a recovery, in which case the channel might be set up in a slightly different way. Perhaps I'd like to unsubscribe from a service. Perhaps I'd like to get rid of it. Perhaps I'd like to resell something, etc. So what's the channel actually going to be used for? And the other thing that's quite interesting here, particularly when you start thinking about the way in which the revenue streams work, is that perhaps this channel isn't owned by us. So there's lots of examples of situations where people have used existing channels of other organizations to allow customers to actually access what goes on. So let's leave that there. Now, we could actually talk about revenue streams in order to complete the value capture piece, but my preference is actually, you can do that, I don't see that there's a problem with that, but my preference would be to move across to the left-hand side here. And in this particular case, I would actually be inclined to say that we've gone 1, 2, 3, 4. The next thing I want to do is, what are the activities that need to be done in order to be able to deliver that value proposition? So what are the actions, what are the processes, etc., that we have to undertake? And once I know that, I can then look at what resources I need. And if it turns out that inside of my organization, I don't have all the resources that I need, or there are some resources which are not going to make a huge difference to the customer interaction, I'll talk about that in a moment, then perhaps what I can start looking at is, therefore, who are my key partners to be able to do this? Okay, so this combination, the combination for value creation, the sequence here I think is important. You can experiment with doing it in different ways, that's entirely up to you. And then you can choose, I think the possible journey here is to look at the cost structure based on what I now understand around the various resources, processes, etc., in order to be able to do that. So that would be number 8. And then ultimately, how would the customer like to pay us? Would be number 9, would be the last place that I would look. And there's a relationship between how they'd like to pay us and both of these aspects here. So we would iterate between those various different elements. So that covers in broad part what's called the business model canvas, and the sequence that I've talked you through. Obviously there's a lot more detail underneath each of these little headings, and there's nine different nodes here. There's a lot more detail underneath, but it gives you an idea of an overview. You could literally take what you've got here and go and run a workshop with your team in order to be able to start putting flesh on the bones of an embryonic idea that you've got in play in order to be able to understand it better. One last quick thought, and that is that one of the real beauties of this particular way of looking at a business model is that what you start to realize is that the group of people who you convene to be able to do this is quite eclectic. So I would need to have possibly a legal person available in the room to be able to look at some of the things that we are dealing with here. I'd need to have marketing people to be able to understand some of these things. I would need to have IT people to be able to do some of the things that optimize and provide channels and so on. I'd need to have the finance people in the room. I'd need to have operations more broadly across some of these things and so on. So around the table in the workshop, you would have a much more eclectic group of people than just the guys who reside in R&D or innovation department or whatever it is that you have as a silo to deliver new products and services. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of what it is that you need.